Before we can grasp the dangers of ignoring the shadow, we must first confront what it actually is. Carl Jung described the shadow as the unconscious repository of all that we reject about ourselves: instincts, impulses, emotions, and traits we deem unacceptable, shameful, or incompatible with the image we wish to project to the world. But contrary to what many would like to believe, the shadow does not dissolve just because we choose to turn a blind eye. In Jung's words, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The shadow is not merely the evil side of our being. It encompasses all aspects of ourselves that have been neglected or suppressed, whether they are dark, powerful, or even deeply creative. As children, we quickly learn which parts of ourselves are socially acceptable and which ones are not. Through the process of adaptation to family, culture, and social expectations, vast portions of our psyche are cast into the unconscious. Over time, these banished parts form an autonomous structure, the shadow, operating in the background, shaping our reactions, choices, and biases without our conscious awareness. Ignoring the shadow, then, is not a neutral act. It is an act of psychological division, of splitting ourselves into the person we believe we are and the unknown self we refuse to acknowledge. Every time we repress anger, envy, greed, fear, lust, or even our capacity for boldness and resilience, these energies do not vanish. They simply move into the shadow, growing in strength and autonomy. Jung noted that the less the shadow is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. What we refuse to face within ourselves becomes the force that quietly controls us. The tragedy is that by denying the shadow, we paradoxically give it more power. We create a psychic blind spot, an inner no-man's land where dangerous elements fester unseen. Meanwhile, we craft a carefully curated persona, the mask we show to the world, designed to conceal the unacceptable realities within. This persona, polished and socially compliant, becomes a brittle shell that can crack at any moment under the pressure of the suppressed energies raging beneath it. The consequences of this split are profound. By hiding from our own darkness, we alienate ourselves from the full spectrum of human experience. We deny the complexity, richness, and vitality that come from embracing our wholeness. In Jung's framework, true growth, true individuation, Hypocrisy cannot occur without engaging with the shadow. The path to authenticity runs directly through the territories we fear the most. To pretend otherwise is to live a half-life, dominated by unseen forces that pull our strings from the depths of the unconscious. Furthermore, the content of the shadow is deeply personal. It is shaped by our individual histories, traumas, disappointments, and unmet potentials. For one person, the shadow may hold aggressive tendencies. For another, it may be an unrealized gift for leadership or creativity, buried under years of fear and conformity. This means that the task of confronting the shadow is not a one-size-fits-all journey. It requires intimate, courageous self-examination, a willingness to encounter the unfamiliar within. Jung warned that if we fail to make the unconscious conscious, it will rule our lives and we will call it fate. We will see ourselves trapped in repeated patterns of failure, conflict, and disillusionment, never realizing that the true battle is within. Ignoring the shadow does not make us safe. It makes us vulnerable to ourselves. It places us at the mercy of forces we refuse to see, forces that find expression in the subtle sabotages, compulsions, and projections that haunt our lives. To ask, "What am I really hiding?" is not a trivial question. It is a summons to venture into the heart of our own darkness, to retrieve the lost parts of ourselves, and to reclaim the energy locked within them. Only by facing what we have disowned can we hope to move beyond it. In this light, the shadow is not merely an adversary. It is also a potential ally, a source of vitality, authenticity, and deep transformation. But to engage with it demands more than intellectual curiosity. It demands the rarest form of courage, the courage to see ourselves without illusion. In the next step of our journey, we will see what happens when we refuse this call, when repression turns our own inner life into a battleground, birthing an enemy within. When we choose to ignore our shadow, it does not simply retreat into silence. Instead, it transforms, often quietly, sometimes violently, into an inner adversary. Carl Jung emphasized that what you resist persists, and nowhere is this more evident than in the way our unacknowledged darkness begins to act against our conscious intentions. The more we repress the shadow, the more it gains autonomy and seeks expression, often in forms that are destructive, bewildering, and painful. The process is insidious. At first, it may manifest as subtle forms of self-sabotage, procrastination, unexplained fears, chronic indecision, a gnawing sense of inferiority. We might tell ourselves that these are minor flaws, quirks of personality, things we can fix with enough willpower or discipline. Yet underneath, something deeper is unfolding, a split within the psyche that pits conscious will against unconscious content. In Jungian terms, the ego, our conscious sense of identity, becomes locked in a silent losing battle with the shadow. As repression deepens, the inner enemy grows bolder. Resentments fester, often disguised as irritability, cynicism, or withdrawal. Passions and desires that have been denied begin to seek expression in distorted ways, through addiction, compulsion, or destructive relationships. Physical symptoms may also emerge: chronic fatigue, headaches, gastrointestinal issues, the body itself bearing the burden of a psychic war. Jung recognized this phenomenon and often linked certain neurotic symptoms directly to unresolved conflicts with the unconscious. The tragedy is that we often do not recognize the enemy within as a part of ourselves. Instead, we feel victimized by life, by fate, by others. We say, "Why does this always happen to me?" Or, "Why do I sabotage my own happiness?" without realizing that the very parts of ourselves we have rejected are orchestrating these outcomes. The shadow, ignored and unloved, turns malicious, not out of inherent evil, but because it has been treated as an enemy for so long that it knows no other way to reach consciousness. Jung spoke often of the return of the repressed, the psychological law that nothing we bury within ourselves ever stays buried. In dreams, slips of the tongue, irrational bursts of emotion, and sudden uncharacteristic behavior, the shadow breaks through. Each eruption is a warning sign, a signal that a part of ourselves is suffocating and demanding recognition. Yet many continue to double down on repression, believing that if they only exert more control, more discipline, they can finally silence the darkness within. Ironically, this only strengthens it. One of the most dangerous outcomes of prolonged repression is the phenomenon of projection, seeing in others the traits we cannot bear to admit in ourselves. But even before projection takes full hold, repression sets the stage for a deeply fractured existence. We become strangers to our own hearts. Our choices feel hollow. Our relationships suffer because we unconsciously demand from others the wholeness we have denied ourselves. We chase external validation, success, or pleasure, hoping these things will fill the void left by our inner division, only to find that they never do. At its worst, the inner enemy can lead to profound despair. Depression, in Jung's view, was often a crisis of the divided self, a heavy, crushing sadness born from the soul's recognition that it has been torn apart. Anxiety, too, can be seen as the psyche's alarm system, signaling that something vital within us has been exiled and is fighting to return. In these states, people may feel as though they are at war with invisible forces, failing to realize that these forces are fragments of their own denied humanity. The process of repression turning against us also explains why sudden, shocking actions sometimes erupt from seemingly good or normal individuals. A lifetime of disciplined persona building can collapse in an instant under the weight of a shadow too long ignored. Scandals, breakdowns, violence, these are not random events but the inevitable consequences of psychic forces demanding acknowledgement. Jung believed that the more rigid and moralistic a person appears, the greater the danger that their shadow will one day break loose in uncontrollable ways. But why do we resist facing the shadow in the first place, even when the cost of ignoring it becomes so clear? Part of the answer lies in fear. Fear of pain, fear of losing control, fear of seeing parts of ourselves we have been taught to despise. We imagine that if we open the door to our darkness, we will be overwhelmed, consumed, destroyed. Yet in truth, it is the very act of refusal that brings about these outcomes. The shadow, when acknowledged and integrated, becomes a source of strength. When repressed, it becomes a saboteur. Jung once wrote, "The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate." This is the terrible irony. The more we run from ourselves, the more we seem to be pursued by a cruel and unforgiving world. But the cruelty is not out there. It is a mirror of the cruelty we have inflicted upon our own souls by denying them the light of awareness. The birth of the inner enemy is not inevitable. It is a consequence of choices made to preserve comfort, image, and control at the expense of truth, vitality, and wholeness. Every moment we turn away from self-examination, every time we prioritize appearances over authenticity, we feed the enemy within. Understanding this sets the stage for recognizing one of the most common and devastating effects of ignoring the shadow, the trap of projection. In the next step of our exploration, we will see how the darkness we refuse to own within ourselves begins to shape the way we see and judge everyone around us. When the shadow is ignored and repression becomes a way of life, a new phenomenon emerges almost inevitably: projection. Carl Jung considered projection one of the most dangerous mechanisms of the unconscious. Instead of seeing reality as it is, we begin to see the contents of our own shadow cast onto the people around us. Our judgments, our hatreds, our intolerances. They are often not reactions to the true nature of others, but rather mirror reflections of what we refuse to accept within ourselves. Projection is seductive because it is unconscious. We do not realize we are doing it. In our minds, it feels justified, rational, even righteous. We tell ourselves, "I am angry because that person is arrogant, cruel, or selfish," without recognizing that the traits we most violently react to may, in fact, be suppressed elements of our own personality. Jung observed that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Yet most prefer to wage war against the world rather than turn inward and face the disowned parts of their own soul. The trap of projection is that it distorts our perception of reality. We no longer see people for who they are. We see them through the lens of our own inner conflict. Friends become enemies. Lovers become threats. Leaders become demons. The world itself begins to appear hostile and malicious, not because it truly is, but because we have filled it with the darkness we dare not confront within. Projection is the mechanism by which the inner enemy, born of repression, extends its influence outward into every corner of our lives. At a societal level, projection can become catastrophic. Jung warned that mass movements, wars, and collective acts of hatred are often fueled by the projection of a society's collective shadow. A community that refuses to face its own inner contradictions will inevitably seek a scapegoat, an external enemy onto whom it can project its fears, rage, and guilt. History is littered with tragic examples: persecutions, genocides, witch hunts, ideological purges. Each is a grim testimony to the destructive power of the shadow unleashed through mass projection. But even on a personal level, the consequences are devastating. Relationships crumble under the weight of unconscious accusations. Friendships wither as trust erodes. Family ties are strained by misunderstandings that, at their core, are projections of inner wounds. Romantic relationships, in particular, become battlegrounds for the projected shadow. We idealize partners at first, projecting onto them the parts of ourselves we long to realize, and later demonize them when they fail to live up to our unconscious expectations, revealing instead the traits we fear or despise in ourselves. Projection also blocks growth. As long as we are convinced that the problem is out there, we avoid the painful but necessary work of introspection. We remain trapped in cycles of blame, resentment, and victimhood, forever running from the real confrontation that could free us. The confrontation with our own shadow. Jung stressed that the meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow. To refuse this meeting is to condemn ourselves to perpetual misunderstanding of ourselves and of the world. An essential point Jung made is that the stronger the repression, the more intense the projection. People who are most blind to their own flaws tend to be the most judgmental, the most moralistic, the most eager to point out the sins of others. This is not because they are inherently virtuous, but because their inner world is so intolerable to them that they must constantly locate evil outside themselves to preserve their fragile sense of self. In this way, moral superiority is often a mask for deep inner fragmentation. But projection is not only about recognizing traits we dislike. Sometimes we project positive qualities, our own hidden strengths, talents, and virtues, onto others as well. This can manifest as intense admiration, idealization, or even obsession. We see others as more courageous, more creative, more worthy, without realizing that these are qualities latent within ourselves, waiting to be acknowledged and developed. In both positive and negative forms, projection serves the same purpose: to avoid direct ownership of who we really are. The solution to projection, then, lies in radical self-awareness. Every time we have a strong emotional reaction, whether hatred, disgust, envy, or blind adoration, we are given a clue. What is it in this person that touches something so deep within me? What am I seeing in them that perhaps I have not yet seen or accepted in myself? Jung advocated for an attitude of ruthless honesty, a willingness to use our emotional responses as mirrors rather than weapons. Yet this is not an easy path. It requires dismantling the protective walls we have built around our fragile egos. It demands the humility to admit that we too are capable of the very things we condemn in others, that the seeds of betrayal, cruelty, cowardice, and selfishness exist within our own hearts, just as the seeds of greatness, compassion, bravery, and love do. Integration of the shadow means acknowledging this full range of possibility within ourselves rather than continuing to externalize it. When we cease to project, we begin to reclaim our own power. We stop being at the mercy of an illusory world populated by enemies and threats. We can see others more clearly, love more authentically, and engage with life from a place of wholeness rather than fear. This is the foundation for true freedom, not the freedom from external circumstances, but freedom from the unconscious forces within us that distort perception and drive us towards self-destruction. Ultimately, the projection trap is a prison of our own making, and one that only we can dismantle. By taking back what we have cast onto the world, by owning our light and our darkness, we step onto the path of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who we truly are. But this path demands something rare: the willingness to bear the tension of opposites within ourselves, to hold light and shadow in a dynamic, conscious relationship. In the next part of our journey, we will explore what happens when this internal division is allowed to deepen, when the self becomes fragmented and unity is lost, leading to profound psychological suffering. When the shadow is ignored and projection takes hold, a deeper wound begins to form: the fragmentation of the self. Carl Jung believed that the human psyche naturally strives for unity, for a wholeness in which all aspects of the self, conscious and unconscious, light and dark, are harmonized. But when parts of the psyche are consistently repressed and denied, the individual begins to lose that precious inner unity. What remains is not a coherent, authentic self, but a collection of fractured identities struggling for dominance, each disconnected from the others, each craving a center that seems forever out of reach. This fragmentation is often invisible at first. People may live outwardly successful lives while inwardly feeling an unbearable sense of division. The facade of normalcy conceals a soul at war with itself. There is the public self we show to the world, curated, polished, acceptable. And there is the secret self, the buried emotions, forbidden impulses, unacknowledged wounds. Over time, the gap between these selves widens until it becomes a chasm. Anxiety, depression, chronic dissatisfaction. These are not random afflictions, but symptoms of a life lived in exile from one's own soul. Jung described this state as a loss of the center. Without a unifying core, a person becomes fragmented, tossed about by conflicting inner voices and contradictory desires. One part of the psyche seeks security, another craves adventure. One part longs for intimacy, another recoils from vulnerability. One part strives for moral perfection, while another is drawn to transgression. Without integration, these forces pull the individual in opposing directions, creating exhaustion, confusion, and despair. Worse still, fragmentation often leads to the construction of an even more rigid persona, a mask designed to hide the chaos within. We become performers, acting out roles we believe will secure love, acceptance, or success, while the authentic self withers beneath layers of social expectation. The more energy we invest in maintaining the persona, the less energy remains for genuine living. Life becomes mechanical, devoid of true passion or meaning. We find ourselves asking, "Who am I really?" and hearing only silence in response. Jung warned that the divided self is prone to falling under the sway of unconscious complexes, autonomous clusters of repressed emotions and ideas that operate independently of the conscious will. These complexes act like splinter personalities, hijacking behavior in moments of stress or emotional vulnerability. A simple disagreement escalates into rage. A minor failure triggers a spiral of shame. A moment of attraction becomes an act of betrayal. It feels as though something took over. And in a sense, it did. The fragmented psyche cannot act with unity because it no longer possesses it. This inner disunity also leaves us vulnerable to external manipulation. Without a strong, integrated center, we become easy prey for ideologies, cults, toxic relationships, anything that offers the illusion of coherence and certainty. Jung observed that totalitarian regimes, for example, thrive on populations of fragmented individuals seeking external authority to compensate for their lost inner authority. A person who does not know themselves is desperate for someone or something to tell them who they are. Perhaps the most tragic consequence of fragmentation is the loss of meaning. Jung believed that meaning is not found in external achievements or possessions, but in the inner experience of coherence, the sense that one's life is an expression of a unified self. Without this, even success tastes bitter. Even love feels hollow. We drift through life disconnected from our own depths, haunted by the suspicion that we have somehow missed the point. Healing this fragmentation requires courage. It demands that we cease running from the parts of ourselves we fear and begin the arduous work of integration. Jung called this the process of individuation, the gradual reconciliation of the conscious and unconscious, the light and the shadow, the known and the unknown. Individuation is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming whole. It is about accepting the full reality of who we are, including the contradictions, the wounds, and the darkness. But integration does not mean collapse. It does not mean surrendering to every impulse or embracing chaos. It means creating a conscious relationship with all parts of the self, allowing each to have a voice without allowing any to dominate. It means developing an inner center strong, enough to hold the tension of opposites, to endure ambiguity without collapsing into despair or fanaticism. Jung often emphasized the symbol of the mandala, the sacred circle, as a representation of the self in its fullness, where every element finds its rightful place within a greater order. The path toward inner unity is not linear. It is a spiral marked by setbacks, regressions, and periods of darkness. There are moments when the fragmentation seems to worsen before it begins to heal, as buried material rises to the surface. There are times when the false persona crumbles, leaving behind a terrifying sense of emptiness. But these are necessary stages. They are signs that the psyche is reorganizing itself around a deeper, truer center, one not built on repression or performance, but on authenticity and acceptance. In practical terms, the work of integration involves practices like shadow work, active imagination, dream analysis, honest self-reflection, and sometimes therapeutic support. It requires facing the uncomfortable truths about ourselves without judgment, recognizing that every trait, every emotion, every impulse has its rightful place within the totality of the self. It requires learning to live with paradox, to accept that we can be both strong and vulnerable, both loving and selfish, both noble and flawed. Ultimately, losing inner unity is not the end of the story. It is a call, a summons from the depths of the soul to embark on the heroic journey of self-discovery and self-acceptance. The pain of fragmentation is real, but it is also a guide, pointing us toward the work we must do to become whole again. In the next stage of our exploration, we will see how ignoring the shadow not only fragments the self, but also creates a false persona of virtue and moral superiority, a mask that hides the growing corruption within. When the shadow remains unrecognized, not only does the self fragment, but a new danger emerges. The construction of a false self-image steeped in hypocrisy and moral superiority. Carl Jung observed that individuals who repress their darker impulses often compensate by over-identifying with their conscious ideals, creating a facade of purity that conceals the corruption festering underneath. In other words, the more we deny the existence of our shadow, the more desperately we cling to a persona of righteousness, and the more virtuous we try to appear, the more viciously our unacknowledged darkness grows. This phenomenon is not merely psychological, it is profoundly existential. To reject parts of oneself is to live a lie, and the maintenance of that lie requires constant vigilance, judgment, and self-deception. In time, the individual becomes a stranger to their own soul, engaging in elaborate performances of goodness, while harboring secret resentments, hatreds, and desires. Hypocrisy is not just a moral failing, it is the inevitable outcome of a life built on disowning the truth of one's own nature. Jung saw hypocrisy as a kind of spiritual disease, a disconnection from the vital forces of life. True morality, he argued, does not come from pretending to be good, but from integrating and consciously managing the full spectrum of human impulses. It is not in the suppression of evil that virtue is found, but in the conscious recognition and responsible channeling of the shadow. Those who believe themselves wholly good are often those most controlled by the parts of themselves they refuse to see. Nowhere is this more evident than in the public arena. History is filled with examples of leaders, religious figures, and social influencers who built their reputations on moral superiority, only to later be exposed in acts of profound corruption. The very people who preached the loudest against sin were often those living double lives, trapped by the very vices they condemned in others. Jung warned that the greater the outward insistence on virtue, the greater the likelihood of inner, moral decay. This is because moral superiority serves as a defense mechanism. It allows individuals to externalize their own inner conflicts by projecting them onto the world. By condemning others, they shield themselves from facing their own flaws. Every judgment cast outward is, in truth, a desperate attempt to silence the whispering voice within that says, "You too are capable of this." In this sense, the pursuit of a flawless public image becomes a prison, a constant exhausting battle against one's own humanity. On a collective level, the cult of moral superiority can become a social pathology. Communities, movements, and entire cultures can fall into the trap of believing in their own inherent goodness while demonizing outsiders. They lose the capacity for self-critique, blind to the shadow dynamics operating within their own systems. Wars have been waged, atrocities committed, and countless lives destroyed in the name of righteousness. Jung saw this as the inevitable outcome when societies refused to do the painful work of confronting their collective shadow. But hypocrisy is not always grand or public. It lives in the small, everyday acts of self-deception. The person who demands honesty but lies to themselves. The one who preaches compassion but secretly harbors contempt. The one who advocates for justice but exercises cruelty in private. Each instance is a betrayal of the self, a reinforcement of the split between the idealized image and the hidden reality. Over time, living in this split becomes unbearable. The tension between the persona and the shadow creates inner pressure that seeks release. Sometimes this results in scandalous public collapses, the sudden exposure of double lives, the shocking revelation of crimes, the fall from grace. Other times, it manifests in more subtle but equally devastating ways: chronic anxiety, depression, addiction, relational breakdowns. The psyche cannot indefinitely sustain the strain of living in contradiction. Jung emphasized that the antidote to hypocrisy is not the pursuit of an even more rigid morality, but the cultivation of radical honesty with oneself. It is the willingness to admit, "I am not wholly good nor wholly evil. I am a complex, contradictory being, capable of both." This admission does not absolve responsibility. Rather, it deepens it. To recognize the shadow is to accept the lifelong task of consciously managing one's inner forces, rather than being unconsciously possessed by them. True moral strength, in Jung's view, arises from integration, not repression. It comes from facing the darkness within and choosing, again and again, to act from awareness rather than impulse. It is found in humility, the understanding that no one is immune to temptation, and that virtue lies in vigilance, not denial. It is embodied in compassion, both for oneself and for others, knowing that we all wrestle with the same human struggles. This redefinition of morality has profound implications. It shifts the focus from image to substance, from judgment to understanding, from performance to authenticity. It liberates us from the exhausting charade of perfection and invites us into a deeper, more honest relationship with ourselves and the world. It reminds us that light is not the absence of darkness, but the courageous confrontation of it. However, dismantling the false self is no easy task. It requires the death of illusions, the willingness to let go of the comforting lie that we are better, purer, or more righteous than others. It demands a descent into the very parts of ourselves we have most feared and rejected. And it calls for a rebuilding of the self on a foundation not of idealized fantasies, but of lived, integrated experience. In the end, the rise of hypocrisy and moral superiority is a tragic detour on the path to wholeness. It is the price we pay for refusing to face the truth of our own nature. But the way back, though painful, is always open. It begins with the simple, courageous act of turning inward, of asking with unflinching honesty, "What have I hidden from myself? And am I willing, at last, to see?" In the next chapter of our exploration, we will examine what happens when the shadow, repressed and denied for too long, refuses to remain silent and erupts with devastating force, threatening to undo everything we have built. There is a fundamental law in the psyche that Carl Jung identified early in his work. Whatever is repressed does not vanish. It gathers strength in the unconscious, biding its time, waiting for a moment of weakness to break free. The shadow, neglected and denied, does not submit meekly to the conscious ego's attempts at control. Instead, it festers in the dark, gaining intensity, and eventually it bursts forth, often in sudden, violent, and catastrophic ways. When this eruption happens, it does not ask for permission. It overwhelms, it consumes, and it forces the individual, and sometimes society itself, to confront the truth they have long tried to avoid. We often imagine the shadow as something quietly lurking, but when ignored long enough, it transforms into a destructive force. This is why individuals who outwardly seem composed, righteous, and morally superior can, in moments of crisis, act with shocking cruelty, rage, or destructiveness. These explosions are not anomalies. They are the inevitable consequences of prolonged repression. Jung warned that the possession of the shadow leads to disastrous consequences, because the energy that could have been consciously integrated is instead unleashed in its most primitive and destructive form. Personal crises often reveal this dynamic. A person who has spent years suppressing anger may suddenly erupt in uncontrollable fury, shattering relationships and reputations in an instant. Another, who has denied their vulnerabilities, may collapse into profound depression or make impulsive, self-destructive decisions. Others still might engage in behaviors, betrayal, addiction, violence, that seem completely out of character, but are, in reality, expressions of long-repressed parts of themselves. When the shadow is forced underground, it doesn't die. It mutates, becoming more chaotic, more primal, and more dangerous. This phenomenon is not limited to individuals. Societies, too, have collective shadows. Jung observed that entire nations could experience shadow eruptions, leading to war, genocide, and systemic violence. The horrors of the 20th century, he argued, were not merely political or economic failures, but psychic ones. Failures, too, confront the dark aspects of the collective human spirit. When a culture idolizes purity, virtue, or perfection, it invariably creates a vast, seething shadow of resentment, hatred, and violence that will eventually demand recognition, often through catastrophic means. In both individuals and societies, the explosion of the shadow often comes as a shock. "I can't believe they would do something like that," people say. "It doesn't fit who they were." But in truth, the seeds were always there, silently growing. The eruption is not a betrayal of the self, but a revelation of the parts that were disowned, unacknowledged, and left to rot in darkness. As Jung put it, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." One of the most dangerous aspects of shadow eruptions is their unpredictability. Because the shadow is unconscious, the ego cannot anticipate how or when it will emerge. A seemingly minor event, a breakup, a job loss, a public humiliation, can act as the catalyst that unleashes years of buried rage, grief, or fear. And once released, the shadow acts autonomously. It does not negotiate, it dominates. People often describe these moments as feeling possessed or out of control, as if another being had taken over their actions. In a very real psychological sense, this is true. The aftermath of a shadow explosion is often devastating. Relationships are shattered, careers are destroyed, reputations are tarnished, and the individual's sense of self is left in ruins. But, paradoxically, these crises can also be moments of potential rebirth. If the individual has the courage to face the truth of what has been revealed, to own the disowned parts rather than retreat back into denial, profound transformation becomes possible. The crisis becomes an initiation, a brutal but necessary gateway to greater self-awareness and wholeness. However, many do not seize this opportunity. Instead, they double down on repression, blame external circumstances, or sink into despair. Jung observed that without conscious engagement, the psyche will simply rebuild the same structures of denial, setting the stage for future, perhaps even more destructive eruptions. Healing requires conscious integration, a willingness to acknowledge the contents of the shadow, to feel the painful emotions, and to find constructive ways to live with, and even honor, the darker aspects of the self. In practical terms, this integration often involves difficult, humbling work. It requires examining the moments when anger, jealousy, greed, lust, or cruelty arise within us, not to suppress them, but to understand them, to trace their origins, to listen to the messages they carry. Every shadow impulse has a story to tell about unmet needs, unhealed wounds, or stifled potentials. By listening rather than silencing, we can begin to transform destructive energies into creative ones. Jungian techniques, such as active imagination, dream analysis, and working with archetypes can be invaluable tools in this process. Dreams, in particular, often reveal shadow material long before it erupts in waking life. Nightmares of violence, betrayal, or monsters are not signs of a deranged mind, but of a psyche trying desperately to bring unconscious content into awareness. To ignore these warnings is to court disaster. To heed them is to walk the difficult but rewarding path toward integration. Ultimately, the danger of shadow eruptions serves as a stark reminder. Repression is not a viable long-term strategy. What we refuse to face within ourselves will eventually force itself upon us, and often with far greater violence than if we had confronted it voluntarily. As Jung said, "What you resist not only persists, but grows in size." To live wisely, then, is not to build higher walls against the darkness, but to make peace with it, to recognize it as an inseparable part of the self. In the next step of our journey, we will explore how this peace can be achieved, not through denial, but through the courageous work of shadow integration, and how embracing our darkness can lead to a profound psychological liberation. After recognizing the devastating consequences of ignoring the shadow, we arrive at the most crucial and perhaps the most daunting step: facing it. Carl Jung described this journey not as a minor psychological adjustment, but as a profound and perilous undertaking, a confrontation with the very aspects of ourselves we have spent a lifetime avoiding. Shadow work is not a trendy self-help practice. It is a radical act of self-honesty, requiring immense courage, humility, and perseverance. To engage in shadow work is to voluntarily descend into the underworld of the psyche, to meet the monsters we have banished and the wounds we have buried. It means looking squarely at our envy, our rage, our greed, our cruelty, not to justify or indulge them, but to understand them, to reclaim them, and to integrate them into a larger, more authentic sense of self. Jung believed that without this confrontation, true psychological growth, what he called individuation, is impossible. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, he wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. The first step in shadow work is recognition. We must become attuned to the signs of our own disowned parts. They appear in our overreactions to others, in the qualities we most despise or idolize, in the patterns of behavior that sabotage our best intentions. They whisper through our dreams, surface in our fantasies, and lurk in the anxieties and compulsions we cannot explain. Shadow material often feels alien, repulsive, or deeply shameful, which is why the ego instinctively rejects it. But to heal, we must approach these parts with a spirit of curiosity rather than condemnation. This process demands a brutal honesty that few are willing to sustain. It is not enough to make intellectual acknowledgments, to say, "I have a temper," or "I can be selfish." True shadow work involves feeling the emotions we have suppressed, confronting the memories we have distorted, and allowing ourselves to experience the vulnerability we have armored ourselves against. It is a descent into grief, guilt, fear, and pain, not to wallow in them, but to liberate ourselves from their unconscious control. Jung warned that shadow work is not safe. It destabilizes the neat narratives we have constructed about who we are. It threatens the identity the ego has painstakingly built. It can provoke intense resistance, denial, rationalization, projection, or even physical symptoms. Many who begin this journey retreat quickly, overwhelmed by the discomfort. But those who persist discover something astonishing. Beneath the darkness lies not only pain, but also vitality, creativity, and a profound sense of aliveness. For the shadow does not consist solely of negative traits. It also holds the unlived life, the passions, talents, desires, and potentials that were exiled because they did not fit the persona we were taught to cultivate. In the shadow resides the rebel who speaks inconvenient truths, the lover who yearns for authentic connection, the warrior who demands justice, the artist who dares to create without permission. Reclaiming these parts is not only an act of healing, but an act of becoming fully alive. Shadow work, therefore, is not about annihilating the darkness, but about establishing a relationship with it. It is about learning to see anger as the guardian of boundaries, fear as the protector of vulnerability, desire as the compass of authenticity. It is about discerning when these forces serve us and when they seek to sabotage us, and about consciously choosing how to express them. As Jung emphasized, the gold is in the dark. Only by facing what we fear can we uncover the treasures hidden within it. Practical methods for engaging in shadow work are varied, but all require intention, patience, and compassion. Journaling can be a powerful tool. Writing without censorship about resentments, fears, jealousies, and fantasies can reveal shadow material that would otherwise remain hidden. Dream analysis offers another gateway, as dreams often present the shadow in symbolic form, as monsters, strangers, or distorted reflections of the self. Active imagination, a Jungian technique, involves entering into dialogue with figures or forces from the unconscious, allowing them to express their perspectives. Therapeutic. Relationships, when rooted in trust and depth, can also be profound arenas for shadow work. A skilled therapist can mirror the shadow aspects the individual cannot or will not see, guiding them through the painful but necessary process of acceptance and integration. However, shadow work is ultimately an inner journey. No one else can do it for us. It demands a fierce commitment to truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable or shattering. One of the greatest challenges in shadow work is avoiding the temptation to either indulge or reject the shadow. Some, upon encountering their darker impulses, justify them, mistaking recognition for permission. Others, overwhelmed by guilt or fear, try to repress them even more forcefully. True integration requires a middle path, acknowledging the reality of the shadow without allowing it to dominate. It is a dance between acceptance and discernment, between compassion and responsibility. The rewards of this work, though hard-won, are immense. As we integrate the shadow, we become less reactive, less judgmental, less beholden to unconscious compulsions. We gain a deeper, richer sense of self, one that can hold complexity, contradiction, and paradox without collapsing. We become capable of genuine empathy, having recognized in ourselves the same struggles we see in others. We cultivate resilience, having faced and survived our own inner darkness. Most importantly, we move closer to wholeness. Jung envisioned individuation as the goal of life, not perfection, but integration, not purity, but fullness of being. Shadow work is the crucible in which this wholeness is forged. It is the path through which we cease being fragmented selves, torn between persona and shadow, and instead become unified beings, grounded in the reality of who we are. But this path is not linear. Shadow work is a lifelong endeavor. New layers of the shadow reveal themselves at different stages of life, often triggered by crises, losses, or major transitions. Each encounter is an invitation to deepen, to expand, to become more real. And each time we say yes to this invitation, we take another step toward the authenticity, freedom, and strength that can only be found when we have made peace with our darkness. In our final exploration, we will see how the fruits of shadow work, this hard-won integration, lead not only to personal liberation, but to the realization of our deepest potential, becoming who we were truly meant to be. The journey toward individuation, Carl Jung's term for the process of psychological wholeness, is ultimately a journey toward freedom. This is not the freedom of the ego's desires, nor the fleeting freedom promised by external circumstances, but the liberation that comes from embracing one's entire self, the light and the shadow, the known and the unknown. It is a profound kind of freedom, one that transcends mere autonomy and enters the realm of authenticity. It is only by fully integrating the shadow, by confronting the parts of ourselves we have long feared or rejected, that we can finally step into the fullness of our being. To become who we were meant to be is not to strive for an idealized version of ourselves, a flawless, perfect self. Rather, it is to become whole, to embrace our contradictions, our weaknesses, our flaws, and our vulnerabilities alongside our strengths and virtues. It is in this acceptance, this synthesis of opposites, that the true self can emerge. Jung described this process as the conscious realization of the self, a state where the ego no longer seeks to control or suppress, but allows the totality of the psyche to be lived. The integration of the shadow is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process. As we evolve, new layers of the self emerge, new aspects of the unconscious come to light, and new opportunities for growth present themselves. However, unlike the fragmented, disjointed experience of living with an unintegrated shadow, the person who has embraced their wholeness moves through life with a sense of cohesion. There is no longer a war within, no longer the constant battle between the good persona we present to the world and the darker, repressed elements that lurk beneath the surface. Instead, we move through life with a unified sense of purpose, knowing ourselves deeply and acting from that place of deep self-awareness. Jung's concept of the self transcends the limited, fragmented ego. It is the totality of the person, the integration of both conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. The ego, in Jungian terms, is the I that we identify with, the image of ourselves that we project to the world. However, this image is only a small fraction of who we are. The self, by contrast, is the entire organism of the psyche, the ego, the unconscious, the shadow, and the various archetypal forces that shape our inner world. It is the larger container in which the ego exists, and only by coming into contact with this deeper self can we achieve true psychological wholeness. This wholeness is not achieved by denying or suppressing parts of the self. The ego, after all, is not inherently flawed. It serves an essential function in organizing our conscious experience. However, when the ego is cut off from the unconscious, when it represses or ignores the shadow, it becomes fragile, defensive, and reactive. The shadow, left unchecked, can then take on a life of its own, creating disruptions in our lives and relationships. Wholeness comes when the ego acknowledges its limits and submits to the deeper wisdom of the unconscious. It is a process of self-surrender, of trusting that the psyche, when fully integrated, will guide us toward authenticity. This surrender is not passive. It is an active, conscious choice to engage with the full complexity of our being. To be whole is to be in constant dialogue with the unconscious, to learn from our dreams, to listen to the symbolic language of the psyche, and to be willing to face whatever arises with openness and courage. This dynamic interaction between ego and unconscious fosters a sense of inner balance and harmony. It is through this balance that we find our deepest purpose, our true vocation, and the strength to navigate the world with clarity and confidence. When we embrace our wholeness, we become capable of living our lives in alignment with our most authentic desires and values. The ego, no longer shackled by the fear of the shadow, can act with clarity and purpose. We are free to follow the call of our inner self, whether that means pursuing creative endeavors, building deep and meaningful relationships, or contributing to the world in ways that reflect our deepest convictions. The person who has embraced their wholeness is no longer swayed by external pressures, judgments, or fleeting desires. They are driven by an inner compass, one that is guided by the wisdom of both the conscious and unconscious mind. This state of wholeness, however, is not something we can simply achieve and then forget about. It is not an end, but a constant process of becoming. To live authentically is to continuously evolve, to remain open to the unfolding of the psyche and to the mysteries of the self. The journey of individuation is lifelong, a path that leads us ever deeper into the unknown territories of the unconscious. The self, in Jungian terms, is not a static entity, but a dynamic, ever-expanding force, continually revealing new aspects of ourselves as we grow and develop. Each stage of life presents new challenges and opportunities for growth, and each challenge is an invitation to deepen our understanding of who we are. Jung believed that the ultimate goal of individuation was not to achieve perfection, but to live with integrity. Integrity, in this sense, means aligning one's life with the deepest truths of the psyche, acknowledging both the light and the dark, the conscious and the unconscious, and integrating them into a unified whole. It is only when we live with this integrity that we can truly become who we were meant to be. We cease to be fragmented, torn between competing desires and conflicting aspects of the self. Instead, we become integrated, authentic, and whole. This wholeness leads to a profound liberation. Not a freedom from responsibility, but a freedom to act in accordance with our deepest truth. We are no longer bound by the unconscious forces that once governed us. We are free to choose our path, to create meaning in our lives, and to live with authenticity and purpose. The integration of the shadow, the embracing of all aspects of ourselves, enables us to experience life fully and to meet each challenge with strength and clarity. In the end, the journey of individuation, the process of becoming whole, is the most profound gift we can give ourselves. It is the path to true freedom, a freedom rooted not in the rejection of the shadow, but in its full acceptance. By embracing our darkness, we unlock the potential for greatness that lies dormant within us. We step into the fullness of our being, not as perfected beings, but as authentic, dynamic, and ever-evolving expressions of the self. And in doing so, we become who we were always meant to be.